We have the great good fortune this afternoon to have gracing this house the member of the British Parliament for, let's see, Edenbridge, Tonbridge, and Malling? Is that
exactly,
right?
yeah.
The great Tom Tugendhat is a member of Parliament. He chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee for the British Parliament. He has been a soldier of distinction, a veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan, and is going to give us an education today about his thinking on Ukraine. Won't you join me in welcoming Tom Tugendhat? Tom, you're welcome to stand if you prefer, or whatever you like.
Wherever you wish. Yeah. So I thought I'd talk to you for about 10, 15 minutes, something like that, because your questions are going to be much better than my answers, so I'd rather hear from you than from me. And this is certainly not my first trip to AEI, and my first trip here was about 20 years ago when we were all talking about Iraq, so I seem to come back only ever when somebody invades somewhere. And I'm very glad to say this time it isn't us. But let's talk about Ukraine, because what we're seeing in Ukraine is the first time we're seeing state-on-state warfare in Europe. And on one level, we could treat it as though that's what it is. It's a separate fight. It's barely connected to us. It's a distant country about which we know little. But it isn't. I think the very fact that we're all following the words of President Zelensky, the words of the various different leadership voices in Europe, the fact that we're all incredibly interested in who's supplying what to whom, we're seeing a remarkable change in European politics and European policy that has challenged the settlement and the understanding that we've had of the West, the world, in the last 70, 80 years. And in some ways, we're seeing the end of that extraordinary period of peace that we enjoyed, that started in some ways in the 50s, but really started properly with the end of the Cold War in the 90s. And it's worth looking at what this challenge means to us. Because for us, it's not just about food and fuel. I mean, we're all seeing, I can't remember what the price of petrol is here, sorry, gas is here. But I think it's about $6, $7 a gallon, isn't it? Well, it's about £2 a litre in England. And it's something that we really notice. We're also seeing the price of what we call gas, home heating gas, increase 9, 10, sometimes even a bit more than that times. And seeing homes across the United Kingdom really feeling that pinch, really noticing the cost hitting families across our islands. And we're seeing that cost is also feeding through in many other areas. We're seeing the price of pasta and basic goods rising, as, of course, Ukraine's wheat exports have dropped off remarkably. We're seeing the price of agriculture in our own community rise as the various fertilizers that are made in Russia and Ukraine are excluded from our markets. And so we're seeing a sort of a knock-on effect of economics that are really beginning to hurt. But even that isn't the major effect. It may be the immediate effect, but it isn't the major effect. The major effect, actually, is what's happening to the stability of our world, to the decoupling of our different economies, and to the challenges that I think we're going to see, certainly more in your lifetimes than in Gary's. And sorry, Gary, and partly in mine too. What we're beginning to see, really fundamentally, is the era of gentle but progressive globalization beginning to reach its end. The question for us is, what does reversal mean? What do we have to do to make sure that our economies, that our people are safe? And what do we have to do to make sure that our economies are able to prosper through this period? And I think there's various different aspects that we need to look at. The first is the military aspect. It's the obvious one. It's not the most important, but it is the obvious one. The first is, what do we do about the military aspects? And clearly, the United States has maintained a military presence at home and abroad that is incomparable to anybody else's. It's the hegemonic power with no equal and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. But that hegemonic power has been more inward-looking over the last 10, 15 years than it has been for many of the years before that. Now, let's not kid ourselves. This doesn't mean the end of NATO. It doesn't mean that the US is withdrawing from everywhere, but it does mean that the US is no longer quite as active as it was before. From the UK perspective, it's somewhat different, because that reliance on US interest around the world hasn't ended. Of course it hasn't, but it has changed. And it means that the role that the United Kingdom has played in recent years is growing in importance. And that role is effectively the middle cog in a series of wheels, because the US is a massive organization. It's very, very difficult to work with the US military. I say that as somebody who served alongside the 82nd Airborne, a fantastic organization, but quite difficult to plug into just because it's huge. And it's used to working on its own. It's used to working within its own structures, and so it finds it hard to include others. The UK can plug into it, because the UK is just big enough to be able to operate alongside. But other countries like Estonia or Denmark, countries who we served alongside in Afghanistan, countries like the Czech Republic, find it really hard to plug into the United States. Really, really hard. And so the way they do it normally is to plug in through the UK into a US formation or into a US division, or whatever it happens to be. And that role is going to increase in importance as the US changes the way it works around the world. Going back very quickly to the US element in Ukraine, the reason that is so important is because when you look at the US element in Ukraine, the reality is that the Ukrainians now, in all honesty, only have one choice, and it is the United States. Because what the United States offers is something that nobody else can. It's not the size of the armed forces, it's the size of the industrial base that supports them. What we're now noticing is the same thing as many of us discovered in 1915, which is that unless you have an economic base able to sustain the consumption of ammunition at a rate which allows you to prosecute full warfare, full spectrum warfare, you very, very rapidly run out of the ammunition, of the capability to fight. And Ukraine has discovered this, obviously, because they've run out of the Soviet-era kit. We've all run out of the Soviet-era kit that was in the neighboring countries, the former Soviet states. And now many of us are running out of the Western kit, as it were, the NATO kit that we began to supply them with in the beginning. Because that initial few days, that first few days when Britain was able to, frankly, lead by getting those NLAWs, those next-generation light anti-tank weapons into Kiev, was absolutely fundamental to holding the line, to stopping that lightning thrust of Russian troops that were trying to decapitate Ukraine. That was great, we could do that. What we're finding it very difficult to do, however, is to re-equip our own forces or our own industries fast enough to supply the next round, the next ammunition, the next shells, the next whatever it is. And so we're all finding ourselves both more dependent on the United States for its industrial base, but also finding that the United States is slightly less interested in the nearer countries of ours.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing the challenge is not just military. The challenge is also to do with the way in which we organize ourselves as a world. Because, of course, Ukraine isn't just about Ukraine, as ever with these things. Ukraine is about the ability of countries to choose their allies, to choose the way they govern themselves, to have that word that has become so important in the United Kingdom in recent years, to have sovereignty, to actually have the ability to make their own decisions. And we've seen that that's challenged because some countries, in this case Russia, still believe very actively in the old concept of spheres of influence. They believe very actively that they have the right to intervene, and when countries don't wish to be intervened with, they have the right to do so by force. But this isn't just about Ukraine. And here I look at you, who has written a lot on Taiwan, Giselle and Gary, who have spoken about Taiwan enormously over the recent past, over the last 10, 20 years, and see that what we're also watching is a changed understanding of the way China is looking at the different actions that we're seeing in Ukraine. Now, there are some lessons that are good for us, which is Russia's found this a lot harder than they thought they would, and that's great. Turns out corruption costs. It doesn't just cost the country, but it actually costs in combat effectiveness. It costs in every capability that a government is trying to muster. And let's not forget, the military is just another branch of government. But it's also a negative, because what we're seeing that the ways in which we've responded, the sanctions, the different forms of embargo that we've imposed, have had a certain effect on Russia. But you don't need to look very hard to see that they just simply wouldn't have the same effect on China, largely because of our interdependence, but also because China has secured itself a position of global dominance or global action that is far greater than Russia's, and therefore much less vulnerable to the sanctions we could put. So when we look at what we're doing in Ukraine, when we look at the actions that Russia is taking, we should also look at them from Beijing's perspective and see that Beijing is watching this, not in the sense that, I suspect, I can't promise you this, but I suspect that the Chinese state didn't order it or didn't encourage it, but they certainly tolerated it. They certainly knew about it in advance. Whether or not they actually approved it or not, slightly more open to debate, but they certainly didn't stop it. And what they're now watching is different lessons in how you influence the near abroad. And of course, a lot of that focus has been on Taiwan, but actually it shouldn't just be on Taiwan. It should be on many other countries in Southeast Asia and, of course, in Central Asia, where we're seeing increasing Chinese presence in areas like the Shanghai Cooperation Accord organization in those central stans. So I think we're seeing a challenge now to that area that we thought was growing, the area of democratization, and we're seeing a growth of authoritarian power, of autocratic power, and a lot more of it tied either immediately to dictatorships like Russia and China, or indeed subordinated to their influence in other countries around the region, even countries that are sometimes part of the European Union. So we're seeing different pressures going there. Now, the question for us, therefore, is what do we do about this? What do we do about the military element? What do we do about the cost of living element that's challenging us all? And what do we do about the diplomatic element, as it were? What do we do about the global cooperation element? And I think about the military element, there is an increasing awareness in Western Europe that we need to do more ourselves. And this is why Germany's €100 billion promise, this is a one-off, by the way, this isn't every year, but its €100 billion promise is so important, because actually rebuilding a proper industrial base, a military industrial base in Europe is essential. It's also, what do we do about, the question is, what do we do about the cost of living element is, well, when you look at the challenge that we've got coming out of Ukraine, we've got to decide what our options are. Are we going to actually help the Ukrainians win fast, certainly before the winter, in which case we've got a hope of bringing down gas prices and bringing down food prices before they really begin to bite in Europe in October, and then you see countries falling away? Or are we going to decide that actually, you know what, we're not going to help Ukraine win, in which case at least let them lose and save lives in Ukraine, accept that spheres of influence exist, accept that we're going to be defeated, but at least don't watch us be salami sliced, make an active decision to do it. And the last one is the diplomatic. What do we do about the influence around the world? And that's where we have got to get away from the erosion of international institutions that we've been practicing, sadly, in various different ways in our countries for rather too long, and talk about organizations like the United Nations or ASEAN or indeed CPTPP or any number of these different organizations, and look at what they're actually doing, look at what they're actually for. Because ostensibly they talk about themselves as for human rights or for trade or for economic growth. Actually, they're not just for that. What they're actually for is they're there to build up, if you like, the scaffolding of the international system that channels countries, that channels organizations towards democracy, towards the freedoms that we not only enjoy, but are quite unquestionably the desire of, well, any free people and the very fact that the immigration statistics still point very firmly towards Western Europe, towards the United States, point that this isn't a cultural statement, this is a global statement. So those are the three areas that I think we really need to be looking, but I think we have a huge opportunity to do it, but we do have some really big decisions to make. And at the moment, we have made an awful lot of noise about the first response. We're making less noise about the second response, and on the third, we're actively undermining ourselves. And so I think there's a huge challenge for us all to look again at how we balance all three, and we make sure that when we talk about the next event in 20 years' time that I'm invited to speak at, what we're actually talking about is talking about an evolving and growing form of stability around the world, and not the erosion of the stable global environment that we've had the great luxury of living in for the last, well, for me, 48 years. For you, it'll vary. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. A bevy of questions for you. The first one is, because you chair the committee that provides oversight to British government actions, I'd love to have your assessment about how your own government has done, because it looks from the outside that this is what the integrated review promised us the British government would be capable of doing, which is, as a medium-sized country, to be agile enough to take decisions early and capitalize on relatively small commitments of assistance and of military force to outsize effect. And it looks like the Johnson government actually did that very well in Ukraine. You're the oversight for their judgment. How do you grade them?
It's a B. It's a solid B. The latest response has been good. You're right. Ben Wallace got weapons into Kiev in those last days before the attack was launched on the 24th of February, at a time when many other people were still, frankly, equivocating and deciding whether or not they wished to be in any way involved, sadly, including your own government. But the reality is that the war didn't start on the 24th of February, as I'm afraid we know. I mean, it started, you can either count the invasion in 2014, or you can actually go a little bit earlier than that, and you can talk about the Euromaidan protests of the year earlier. And you can see the influence of Putin's Russia in various different ways in those protests, and his attempt to undermine Ukrainian moves towards democracy. I wouldn't call it democratic at that point, but certainly moves towards democracy and moves towards sovereignty. So when we look at the last few weeks, that's great, but let's not pretend you can fatten a pig on market day. You can't. What you've got to do is you've got to start a hell of a long time before. And it's true that British troops were involved in training the Ukrainian armed forces from 2014, well, actually from about 2016, really, by the time the deployment went in and it was all up and running. And of course, those training exercises and those training regimes really did make a difference, and certainly turned what had been a rather pathetic Soviet-era force, which was the Ukrainian army of 2014, into what we see today, which is an incredibly mission-driven, very, very effective group of some of the most extraordinarily courageous people we've had the good fortune to have on our side. But that wasn't enough. Even in 2015, 2016, the Ukrainian government was talking then about its need for upgrading armor, upgrading artillery, upgrading its entire capability. Even then, we were training them, but not always helping quite as much with intelligence as we should have done, not helping quite as much with equipment as we should have done, and so on. And we found ourselves effectively allowing the Russians to believe that they were again in a position that they had been for the last 20, 30 years, which is to have that the luxury that they've had of being the only country in the region that was willing to take the pain of war, was willing to accept the casualties, but also had an industrial base that could sustain one.
Yeah.
What the Ukrainians have, or had up until recently, is they had the same willingness to take the pain, but they simply didn't have the industrial base to support it. Now, this is why I say that the United States is the only country who can do it. If we get this right, in the US, we upgrade the Ukrainian system to a NATO standard so we can actually sustain it, then we can turn the Ukrainians from being a Soviet satellite or Russian satellite into the front line of freedom that they are choosing to be. I mean, let's not forget, what President Zelensky has done is not just unify a country, it's not just inspire a defense, but actually he's done something pretty remarkable that only Germany has done before. And Germany did it in that post-Second World War period. Ukraine has offered itself as the battleground for our own defense.
Yeah.
You know, we should be absolutely conscious of the extraordinary commitment that it has made to the freedom of Western Europe and indeed the United States.
And that does seem to prejudice the path of Western policy. You outlined two potentialities, that is, helping Ukraine win fast enough that we don't get into the winter demands for petrol and gas, such that Russia succeeds in fracturing Western unity in support of Ukraine. The second path you outlined is not helping them at all. It looks to me like Western policy, including American policy, is still in the middle ground of helping Ukraine just enough to keep them fighting, but not enough to slice the artery of Russian success. What would you like to see Western policy doing that we're not yet doing?
Well, at the moment, we're hearing a lot about figures. We're hearing numbers with noughts on the end that are being bandied around. Now, that's great on the grounds that sustaining the Ukrainian economy and making sure that the promises are coming in is important. But it's not the answer. The answer is the weapon systems that are able to drive back Russian aggression in the east, at least to the 24th of February line, but really it's up to President Zelensky. I've always been very careful about not saying what the end state should be. After all, it's their country and their lives. So it's got to be up to the president and the people of Ukraine to decide what they are willing to fight for and how far they're willing to go. And President Zelensky has spoken about having conversations with Russia and getting into a discussion that ends this conflict. That's up to him. It's not up to us. We shouldn't be trying to have that conversation for him. But we should be in a position of making sure he can have that conversation from the strongest position.
Right.
And we should be in a position of making sure that he can have that conversation from a strong position as soon as possible. Because the reality is we're already beginning to see Russia testing the coalition. Recently, you saw Nord Stream 1 go offline, and supposedly a part broke that needed to be installed by Germany but supplied by Canada. It's sanctioned.
Yeah.
So in theory, this part can't be supplied.
And the Russians are trying to use food scarcity, that their invasion of Ukraine and blockade of Ukraine's ports, as a way to forestall international opprobrium over their aggression. They think they can fracture Western solidarity. How would you recommend we shore it up to prevent that?
Well, they're trying to fracture Western solidarity in two ways. The first, as I've just spoken about, is the energy. The second is the area that you've just spoken about, which is the food. And it's not just food in Europe or Turkey, which, frankly, we'll get through that. We're wealthy enough, we'll swallow some of the costs. Yes, families will really feel it, and it'll cause political pain. But I think we're unlikely to see starvation in countries like ours. That isn't true in countries in the global south. That is simply not true in the sub-Saharan African region. It's not true in places like Lebanon and Syria that are so dependent on Ukrainian wheat. And it's probably not even true in places like Egypt, where, as we know, only 10 years ago, rises in food and cooking oil prices were one of the triggers that saw the so-called Arab Spring. And so I think what Putin is trying to do is he's trying to do what he has always done, which is to think wider about the points of pressure he has, the leverage he has. And he's looking to use food as a way of destabilizing places that can have an effect on us. And he's learnt his lesson. You know, he saw the effect that 5 million refugees had from Syria in 2015. Now, that led to quite serious destabilization of parts of Eastern Europe. It led to then Chancellor Merkel making a decision that, frankly, led to quite a lot of people questioning Germany's commitment to cooperation in Western Europe, and it led to a feeling, perhaps not a reality, but certainly a feeling of a serious loss of control in Europe. That was 5 million people. Sub-Saharan Africa, a similar food crisis. You're talking tens, possibly hundreds of millions of people on the move. Now, I don't mean all of them come north, all of them go west, but the instability in those countries could be extremely serious. And Russia is not just using food. Russia is also using proxy groups like the Wagner Group, the so-called Wagner Group, which is a mercenary organization, which is operating now in countries like Libya and Mali and Central African Republic, and is also being used not just to stir up instability, but to encourage local potentates, sometimes governments, but often militias, to further destabilize those regions. Now, all of this is geared to be leverage on countries like ours and to force us into positions where we sue for peace in areas where he's interested so that we get the stability in areas where we're more interested.
The shortfall in Russian strategy is whether their military can actually carry it out.
Yep.
I, for one, am just shocked at how bad they are at basic proficiencies. And to your point earlier about the ordnance of the West, the Defense Department is congratulating itself on sending 200,000 artillery shells to Ukraine, which is fabulous and is about 34 days at current rate of Ukrainian expenditure. The Russians are lobbing about 50,000 artillery shells a day. The only thing they seem good at is rate of artillery fire. They seem terribly bad at planning, organization, sustainment. Are you surprised as a longtime watcher of the Russian military?
I'm surprised by bits of it, but not by all of it. So I'm not surprised by the command and control. And that is utterly appalling. But, you know, dictatorships have a way of shooting people who think for themselves. And funnily enough, they end up encouraging people to obey orders no matter how dumb they are. And we've seen this time and time again in various of the assaults on Ukraine, where there's been positions that have been attacked in the same way 13, 14, 15 times in a row. And each attack results in, funnily enough, the same result, which is the death of the attackers. So on one level, I'm not surprised at that. I think what I'm surprised at, and I've certainly asked our own Ministry of Defense for a better understanding of it, is why we got it wrong. Why have we been treating the bear like a bear when, in fact, in some ways, it's a rug?
Or a mangy dog.
Well, the reality is, you know, of course, some of the things that they didn't predict was the level of corruption and how it had filtered so far down. You know, it turned out, and we knew this, right? We knew that President Putin has stolen whatever it is, $200-300 billion off the Russian people in various different ways. That's not news. We all know that. We knew that many of the suppliers of various products and goods to the Russian state have been stealing enormous amounts off the Russian state in order to build the palaces and live in the villas that have been built around Sochi, and actually, sadly, quite often in Western Europe as well, and some of them in London. And we knew that. I don't think what we'd fully appreciated was that the Russian generals were doing exactly the same. And so the 4-star took 10% of the fuel and sold it. The 3-star also took 10% of the fuel and sold it. The 2-star took 10%. And you end up with the supply sergeant has got a Bowser of fuel with a dribble in the bottom, quite a lot of water to top it up and make it look like fuel. And you stick it in the tank goes a couple of miles and then dies. You know, that's the reality of what we found. And we found that their batteries, for their radios weren't working. We found, there was a whole series, there was a pattern of corruption Famously, the tires hadn't been stored properly, so they burst. There's a whole series of things where the pattern of corruption meant that the fighting force of the Russian armed forces was so degraded that they couldn't really endure. But the one thing that they have maintained, because I suppose it's easier to maintain it, is, as you rightly put, the artillery. And according to Russian doctrine or Russian generals, they refer to it as the god of war. And that ability to rain fire from on high is something that they've really developed as a skill. We've seen it in Grozny, we've seen it in places like South Ossetia and Abkhazia, we've seen it, and now we've seen it rather horrifically deployed in southern and eastern Ukraine. So, we're seeing still a capability, even if not the capability that we formerly imagined. So I'd be cautious about being too critical, because although they've demonstrated their incapability of conducting combined arms, what they have demonstrated is their willingness and ability to conduct unbelievably brutal single-front assaults.
Yeah. So you have been such a major force on issues of corrupt money sloshing around free societies. Assess the economic sanctions program for Ukraine. Is it strong enough? Is it doing enough? Is it doing enough fast enough? How do you assess what we in the West have done on sanctions?
So the sanctions are important. The reality is there isn't private money in Russia today, and as the joke in Moscow goes, there's no such thing as an oligarch. There's only people who work as oligarchs. You're allowed to fill the role for a certain period. You're allowed to spend the money, enjoy the Rolls Royce or the Bentley or whatever it is. But you're only a placeholder. It's not actually yours. The money, the car, the house, all belongs to President Putin, all belongs to the state, which is the same thing as President Putin, of course. And so you hold it all effectively in trust. And the sanctions have been important because they've closed down, frankly, the bonus scheme that Putin is able to pay his acolytes. So that in itself is not nothing. That's important. But the reality is this level of sanctions is responsive. It's not actually addressing the fundamental threat that we face. And I'm going to go back to the point I was making at the beginning, which is, of course, Ukraine is important. Of course, it's absolutely fundamental. And, the Ukrainians are genuinely fighting on the front line of freedom. They are defending our liberties as much as their own, and what they're doing is absolutely essential. But it isn't just about Ukraine. We wrote a report in the Foreign Affairs Committee called Moscow's Gold. We published it in May 2018, I think it was. And what we called out there was the spread of dirty money through the City of London. And sadly, I can point to various states and jurisdictions here in the United States, if you like, and highlight some of the similar issues, not the same, but very similar issues on beneficial ownership, on hidden money, on various different problems. And what we were highlighting there is the bit that we still haven't quite addressed properly, which is it's not about a dodgy Russian who's stolen off Russia and is hiding it in New York or in London. That's a problem, but stealing money off the Russian people is a problem for the Russian people. The problem that we're facing is that actually our own countries, our own democracy, our own economy is now being threatened by the spread of this corrupt money. Yeah. It's being threatened in some ways, pretty obviously, and we've spoken about, you've certainly spoken about it in various different ways, in the way it's used to influence electoral politics. We've certainly seen that around the world, most obviously in some countries in Europe, where we're seeing various different groups taking either open loans or secret donations from Russia, and there are certainly accusations of it here in the United States, which I'll leave you to judge, and there are accusations of it in the United Kingdom. That's one element. But actually there's an even more fundamental element. We're seeing a spread of corruption and erosion of trust, which is doing immense harm to the stability of our state and to the trust that is essential in a democracy. We're seeing that, and have seen it growing in the last decade or so, in ways that loans are given, in ways that finance houses, legal firms, real estate companies have been used as tools of oligarchs, not really oligarchs, of autocrats, of dictators, to undermine the democracies that threaten them. And that's where we come down, of course, back to why is Putin really interested in Ukraine? He's not frightened of NATO. He's not really frightened of Ukraine being free. What he is frightened of is Ukraine being free and democratic and prosperous, and the example that that would be clearly to his own people.
That is a great note on which to open it up to all of your questions. I especially want to hear from the students in AEI's Summer Honors Program, some of whom I know are scattered around this room. Anybody have questions? Shay Kassiri, I see you, my friend.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you, Mr. Tugendhat. It was fascinating.
It's so much easier.
So, I have a question about strategic corruption and one on democratic resilience. Which one do you prefer me to ask?
But
They're
you
the same
get one.
question.
Okay. Let me ask you about democratic resilience. You mentioned the problems that the war is creating, including inflation, possible refugee crisis, and as I understand, Russian foreign policy relies a lot on Putin's belief that democracy is a weak and unstable system of government. And if that is true, it appears if it is true that Putin thinks so, that's what I meant. I grew up in Iran. Trust me, I love democracy. If that is true, is it Putin's political strategy to wait out the war, to sow as much chaos as possible? And how longer is the current rising problems sustainable in the United Kingdom? And if you want to comment on broader continental Western Europe.
Good question.
So I think it is true that that's how he sees it. I think Putin does fundamentally see democracy as weak. But, dictators always see democracy as weak. They are wrong, of course. I mean, dictators are consistently wrong about this. And he's not going to be the first, and sadly, he probably won't be the last. Because the reality is dictatorships have massive internal weaknesses that are papered over, but actually the cracks are still there underneath. And we have rather more obvious cracks. We have rather more obvious issues that cause us to look weak. But the reality is we're able to be more resilient for the same reason that bicycles with fixed wheels can only go straight into a wall. We're able to vary the direction and to allow people to find different ways to succeed and therefore build up different paths to resilience. Now, he is trying, as you put it, to exploit those divisions that are natural in a democracy. And he is trying to exploit the so-called cost of living issues, food and fuel, to break up the European partnership, to put pressure on countries that have less variability in their energy supplies, countries like Germany. And he is trying to put increasing pressure on countries that are dependent on food in sub-Saharan Africa and so on. But he doesn't have to win. He doesn't have to win if we are faster in supporting Ukraine so that we bring this to a conflict to an end sooner. Not just for the Ukrainian people, but for ourselves. The reality is I'm seeing people in the community that I'm privileged to represent in Kent, the great kingdom of Kent. I'm seeing households beginning to struggle very seriously with the pressures on them. And the government's ability to respond is, it's variable. And there are some things that are hard to respond to. So the correct thing for us to do is to bring this conflict to an end as quickly as possible. And I'm afraid when I was a soldier, I do remember many of my civilian friends would complain that the battles we engaged in were unequal and this was unfair. And I pointed out that fair fights look like 1914 to 1918, where everybody loses and the defenders lose more, or rather the losers lose more than the victors, but everybody loses. Whether you're the winner or the loser in a battle, you want the fight to be unfair because you want it to be over fast. And so we must do our best to make sure it is unfair and it is over fast.
And if I may add one point, which is that outside the kingdom of Kent, most political leaders aren't doing enough to explain to their publics why we need to bear these burdens. And the broader importance of Ukraine's success. That's something that is in our power to do, and we aren't yet doing at the amplification we are going to need to keep my mom on side on this one. Giselle Donnelly.
I want to ask you about the special relationship, which tends to fade in memory when times are good, but come forward in times of war. It also strikes me that it's very much like the relationship between Major Tugendhat and the commander of the 82nd Airborne.
Lieutenant General, as he now is, I have to call him sir.
Where he shows up at Bagram and says, I'm here to kill people, and he says, Tugendhat, who should I shoot first? So how's it working? Has it come closer together in these last months? Does it need to be improved? What can you tell us?
So, I mean, you know, Giselle, as well as I do, that the special relationship has nothing to do with number 10 in the White House, or very little to do with number 10 in the White House. The reality is it's down to the fact that you and I have known each other for 20 years. It's down to the fact... Yeah, well, more for who? But it's down to the fact that, you know, I had the great privilege of serving under the command of Lieutenant Colonel in the 82nd, who's now made Lieutenant General, and he's a friend and we stay in touch. You know, it's down to the fact that our agencies, our intelligence agencies, our financial regulatory agencies, all of those groups in which government actually happens, you know, the areas where things are done, where politicians don't even know it's being done, those connections are very strong, and they're very strong for 1,000 different reasons, right? Some of them personal, some of them professional, some of them simply because we speak the same language, though you speak it rather badly. And it's certainly true that you know, that relationship is as strong as it has ever been, because you know, whenever we fall out, and we do, we constantly look around the world for somebody else. And we find out there's just the two of us. And so we come back together again. And the reality is, even when we fall out on one issue, it turns out we're working together on 100 others. And so it's never something that concerns me. Because funnily enough, I never think of it as a special relationship in the sense that, you know, I mean, you guys, being the epic diplomats that you are, you have, you label all your 192 relationships in different ways. You have your oldest alliance, which is France, and you have your special relationship in the UK, and you have your, I can't remember what you call your relationship to Ireland, but there's another one, and you know, you've got a name for all of these. You know, you can call the UK relationship a special relationship if you like. The reality is, it is simply the human-to-human contact that we have had for, you know, almost 100 years now, certainly since the beginning of the Second War. That is simply so intertwined. And, you know, we were at Treasury today, and it is perfectly obvious that our Treasury officials are in and out of that building all the time talking about financial crime. You know, it's just that overlap, that continuum is what matters.
I very often have to point out to people that the British are terrible allies. They're selfish, they put the burden on us, and as soon as I can find a better American ally, I will gladly trade them in. But unfortunately, there is no better American ally.
Do you want me to do the reverse?
And I'm pretty sure the reverse is also true. Right here.
Hi, good evening.
And then to the back, and then to Will.
Thank you so much for this incredible discussion, Dr. Shaki and Mr. Tugendhat. So my question to you is how the war in Ukraine really affects the integrated review, particularly the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. So does this mean that the British will now pivot more to a transatlantic focus or a policy of selective engagement, or is the long-term tilt to the Indo-Pacific still the government's top priority?
It's a great question.
Yeah. So I'm a believer that Kurt Campbell's got this right. You've got to be able to walk and chew gum, you know. And the reality is, if a country like the United Kingdom can't do both, then frankly, we really do need to look at ourselves. And we can do both, and we are doing both. You know, Britain is still very actively involved in the five-party defence agreement. We're, you know, we're part of the new Pacific grouping that is now operating. Well, has now been given a kick of life because of the actions that you've just seen in the Solomon Islands. Our relationship to India has never been more important. Prime Minister Modi has been a very important partner in many ways, and the investment that we're making in many aspects of the Indo-Pacific, which isn't just about China. It is actually about all the way from India all the way around to South Korea, is something that we're doing. A lot of us have been working a lot on Taiwan recently, on Japan, and on North Korea. By the way, if you want to know what we really think about the Americans, listen to us speak in private to the Japanese.
I seem to recall this government had to force you to broach the defense treaty you made with Japan as part of the 1923 Washington Naval Accords. So the gal in the back.
Hello, thanks so much for coming tonight. My name is Annie. I'm one of the interns here at AEI. I'm not sure if you were alluding to this when you touched on Syria briefly before, but there's been a couple of claims by journalists that what Putin is doing is essentially weaponizing migration in attempts to splinter Western Europe in their solidarity. So just essentially targeting civilians to overwhelm Europe with refugees for as long as they stand in support of Ukraine. I'm wondering, have you seen any evidence that would substantiate those claims, or do you think that that's mostly speculation?
So the problem with Putin's strategy is it's very hard to say he's doing one thing, if you see what I mean. It's very hard to say he's done X, therefore Y. It's more that what he's doing is he's creating optionality. So he's constantly trying to destabilize everybody and in the chaos find something that works for him. And so I wouldn't say, look, he's deliberately raising food prices in order that, Eritrean migrants move to Libya and Libya to Italy. And, it's not as binary as that. What he's trying to do is to create chaos that he knows that we'll have to turn our attention to in the hope that the chaos will be so great that we allow him to have what he wants nearer to home. And I think it's wrong to think of him as a chess player, as Garry Kasparov has made extremely clear. Putin is no chess player. He's more the thug who walks into the bar with a baseball bat, hits just about everybody he can find, and hopes that in the chaos he'll be able to nick the cash register, before people work out what's going on.
It's a fabulous simile. Will.
Hi, I'm Will. I'm the Russia Studies RA here at AI. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us. So the ruble just hit an 8-year high today, and Russia made record profits from oil and gas sales in the first 100 days of this year. And so I understand that sanctions will have a very significant long-term effect on the Russian economy. My question is, what do you think we can do in the short term to more acutely degrade Russia's war effort?
Well, there's a choice, isn't there? Where do you get the fuel from? And countries that decided that Fukushima meant that they had to get out of nuclear-generated power made decisions that they're paying for today. The reality is, this isn't about oil, it's about gas. If we actually wanted to make the substantive difference that we can, we need to be talking very actively, not just to those European countries that depend on gas, but actually we need to be talking to countries like Qatar, and in fact to countries like the United States and Canada. The province of Alberta could fuel Europe for the next 40 years. Wouldn't it be good if we bought power off a democracy rather than a totalitarian state?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Garrett Wright. I study at Indiana University, but I'm here interning in DC. And my question is about the information war. Most specifically about the West's obligation to penetrate Russia's kind of wall of information that they've put up, eliminating opposition media and pretty much shutting down the internet. So does the West have an obligation to combat that? And if they do, in what way can they do that?
So I think we do, because I think the reality is that we, communication is an essential element to securing the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people and therefore our own defense. But it is really difficult, and one of the things that you'll know has been a problem is that as we've shut down various banking elements, people can't pay for their virtual private networks and so on. Now, years gone by, the agencies got through this by creating things like Tor browsers, the Onion Ring browser, and there's no reason that we can't give away VPNs. We can't, there are various things we could do, and I think we need to look much harder at it. But also, I would love to see us actively playing a much more fundamental part in this, and I keep telling the BBC this. It's fine that we're broadcasting in Russian, and I think that's great, but I'd like us to be broadcasting in Chechen, in Dagestani, in Tatar, and in all the subnational languages as well. Because if you want to pull apart our alliance, let's have a look at how you think about it at home.
James, your own question, my friend.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, sir, for coming. Looking at our own munitions supply here in the US, like we've learned with Stingers and Javelins, that one of the most important things is not just having the military industrial capacity, but having the sustained operations over time that allow us to mobilize at a very rapid rate. I could understand if Europe and the UK are looking to develop their own defense industrial base as you described, but do you think developing a sustained operation is something that Europe is ready to really get behind? And if so, what is it going to take to jumpstart that effort?
So I think the UK is, and I think other European countries are beginning to get there. I wouldn't say the whole of Europe, that's not true. But if you look at the response in Eastern Europe, in Poland, particularly in Romania, and of course in the Baltic states, you see an increasing commitment towards that. And I think, we haven't touched on it yet, but I think the Swedish and Finnish expression of interest to join NATO is also a further indication of that willingness to do that. And let's not forget, Finland has a remarkable military capability, and having that as part of NATO will be a huge asset. So does Sweden. Sorry, I shouldn't cut up the Swedes there, but they both have a remarkable military capability that is, will be a huge asset, and part of that capability is industrial.
So I think we have time for 2 last questions, and we'll take TJ and then Richard.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Tugendhat. I'm in Dr. Chaki's program this week at AEI, and you mentioned the work that the West needs to do to restore credibility to international institutions. How do you think that we can go about doing that, especially since Russia holds a permanent seat on the UN Security Council and the start of this war coincided with a UN Security Council meeting on Ukraine?
Sure. There's a regular drumbeat of opinion that I hear that says because Russia can block things at the UN with its veto, or China can, therefore these organizations are dead. I don't buy that. I mean, frankly, they do many, many different things. But one of the things they do most obviously is they gradually extend the ability of countries like ours, like yours, to normalize legal constructs, legal concepts. And it's not true to say that Russia never uses them or never follows them, or China never uses them or follows them. They do. They only go outside them when they find themselves blocked within them. But the very fact that they're using them, at least for a period, improves the ability to predict some of their actions. And let's not forget what we're actually talking about. The purpose of these organizations is exactly the same as the purpose of the law here in the United States, or the Constitution, or any other legal construct. It's the ability to predict the future. It's the ability to see if this, then that. If a country does X, the reaction will be Y. If an individual does this, the breach of contract conditions are Y. That's what the law is. The law is just simply the earliest human algorithm for predicting the future. I mean, now Facebook has, pumped billions and billions of dollars into doing it over a much longer period. But all that the law is a very, very basic form of futurology. That's all it is. And it's true that there are problems within many of these organizations. If you want to point to corruption, if you want to point to mismanagement, you can point to pretty much any international organization, where it tends to be worse because it's more divorced from the people, it's more divorced from the oversight mechanism, from the nation state. It's true. But it still has an ability to normalize certain actions. And the reality is, I'm always reminded of the Italian response to the Versailles Treaty, where they felt that the things weren't going their way, so they walked away. Well, however badly you think things are going when you're at the table, trust me, if you leave the table, they will go worse for you. The other people will still keep talking.
As
You
the
just
Soviets
won't
found
have-
out when they left the room and the Korean
There you go.
War
Took place.
resolution
Yeah.
passed in the UN Security Council.
No, they were very surprised by it. They thought it would stop because they weren't there, and it didn't stop. It just went ahead. And so I think, organizations like the UN, yeah, there are challenges. There are real challenges. But the real challenges have been actually because we haven't taken it as seriously as we should. If you look, two of my heroes are Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And if you look at the way they fought international positions in the UN in the 1980s, they fought for everything. If you wanted to be on the UNESCO committee on a particular town that was being dug up in Pakistan or whatever, Mahandarir or whatever, they fought for it. They absolutely fought for every single seat, every single vote, every single position. And really, since the 1990s, we thought we'd won. Well, quite a lot of people didn't think that. And so now 4 major international organizations are dominated by China. Several others are dominated by Chinese proxies, because China saw what Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher did, and they copied them. They fought every single seat, and they won many of them. And now they're changing the rules. So the correct thing to do is not to sort of throw your hands up in a huff and walk out. We're not teenagers. The correct thing to do is to fight for every seat. And the reality is, and I come back to the point on migration, there is a reason why people want to come to America. There's a reason why people want to live in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in France, and Germany. There's a reason why, other than Edward Snowden, nobody flees to Russia. Right? It's because actually people like having predictability. They like having the ability to plan their lives and to build their futures. They like having the safety and security of the rule of law and of civil rights. And if we actually make these arguments, if we actually invest in these relationships, we will win these votes. We will absolutely be able to change the United Nations. And you're right, well, there will be vetoes that will really annoy us. And we will respect them, because obeying the rule of law is investing in our own future too. But the more we invest in these organizations, the more we invest in those alliances, and the more times we win these votes, the more we will normalize and we will extend that process of democratization away from places like our own and into countries that would like to side with us. But at the moment, the pressure, whether that's financial or military or social, is pushing them in the other direction.
That's a genuinely outstanding answer about multilateral institutions. Last question right here in front.
Hi, my name is Richard. I'm in Dr. Shaki's class. First things first, thank you for coming and speaking. So you mentioned a really important thing, like the UK and the US should be doing, is helping Ukraine, at least if they go to the negotiating table with Russia, to really make sure that Ukraine is able to consent on what they want. But what many experts say is that the Donbass may or may not be potentially ceded to Russia. Do you see this as a risk that it just greenlights Russia or other states and other forces to continue expansion, similar to like what we saw in Ukraine?
So let's not kid ourselves that this is just about the Donbass, because the way that Putin has spoken about the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass and in other parts of Ukraine is exactly the same way as he's been speaking about the Russian-speaking population in Lithuania and Latvia, Estonia, Poland, many other parts. So, what he's actually doing is he's projecting an idea of government by linguistic group that frankly would have some serious implications on your government too. I'll just leave that one there, if you were to tolerate it.
We can't lose the French speakers to Canada, my friends.
There you go. But it's absurd, and we all know it's absurd. But I am very cautious, quite deliberately, about saying what Ukraine should or should not accept. These are not my lives or the lives of the citizens I represent. These are the lives of Ukrainians that are being fought over, and land that is Ukrainian. It's not up to me to define that. It's up to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people to decide it. I think if we put President Zelensky in a position where he is able to determine the terms of those negotiations, then the lesson will be clear to Putin. If we allow President Putin to determine the terms of those negotiations, then the lesson will also be clear. And so the point is not that, we sign up the Ukrainian people to fight for the last square inch of Crimea or Donetsk or Luhansk or whatever it is, that's up to them. But it's we put them in a position where they are able to make sure that they are sovereign in their own land and are able to make determinations according to the pressures that they have themselves. Now, if we do that, then I think we will have demonstrated that Russian aggression fails, that Putin's war machine is not only defeatable, but has been defeated, and that we will stand with those who are offering the most extraordinary sacrifice to all of us, which is the willingness to fight for the freedom of all of us.
My friends, thank you for making time for this conversation. And won't you join me in thanking strategist, politician, and all-around good guy, Tom Tugendhat.